I don't know what made me wake up that morning with the unshakable urge to return to the old cabin. Maybe it was the way the February air seemed colder than usual, biting through the apartment windows like some kind of omen. Or maybe it was something deeper, something that had been buried inside me for years, waiting for the right time to pull me back. Either way, when I opened my eyes that morning, I knew exactly what I had to do. The old family cabin up in northern Maine wasn't just a vacation spot, it was where I grew up spending summers fishing with my dad and winters chopping wood until my arms burned. But I hadn't set foot on that land in over 10 years, and life had done a damn good job of keeping me away. Marriage, work, the usual grind, none of it left room for nostalgic trips into the woods. Yet here I was, packing a bag like the place was calling me home. When I told my wife, Sarah, she gave me that look, the one where her forehead wrinkles just enough to say, "Are you sure you're not being crazy?" "The cabin? In this weather?" she asked, leaning against the kitchen counter with her mug of tea. "Alex, there's probably 4 feet of snow up there." "It's February." "I know, but I need this," I said, zipping up my duffel bag. "Just a weekend. I'll pack enough supplies, and I know the roads." She wasn't convinced, but she didn't try to stop me either. That's the thing about Sarah, she doesn't fight battles she knows she can't win. "Fine," she sighed, tossing a pair of thick socks into my bag. "Just don't freeze to death." I smiled, kissing her on the forehead. "I'll be back before you know it." By noon, I was on the road, my old Ford truck loaded with enough supplies to outlast an apocalypse. Canned food, whiskey, firewood, blankets, and, just in case, my hunting rifle. The drive out of the city was familiar, and for a while, it felt like any other road trip. The hum of the tires on asphalt, the radio crackling with static as I left civilization behind. But as the highways turned into winding back roads and the snow began to thicken, I could feel that familiar pull in my chest growing stronger. The world outside became a sea of white. The trees lining the narrow road were heavy with snow, their branches bending under the weight. The farther I drove, the quieter everything seemed to get. Towns disappeared, gas stations became rare, and soon it was just me, the truck, and the endless wilderness. Twice, I had to pull over and dig the truck out of the snowdrifts that had swallowed the road. The silence out there was suffocating. My breath came out in thick clouds, and the only sound was the scrape of the shovel against the packed ice. I told myself it was just another roadblock, something I could handle. But deep down, I felt it, the unease growing with every mile. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, the sun had dipped low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at the familiar silhouette of the cabin tucked between 2 towering pines. It looked exactly as I remembered, weathered logs, a sagging roof, and a porch that creaked if you stepped on the wrong plank. But something was off. Footprints. I could see them crisscrossing the front porch, half covered by fresh snow but distinct enough to make my pulse quicken. They weren't animal tracks, these were human. Large, deliberate, and too recent for comfort. I stepped out of the truck, the cold air biting my face. My boots crunched through the snow as I walked closer, examining the prints. Maybe it was a hiker or a hunter passing through. The cabin had been empty for years, but it wasn't completely off limits to the occasional traveler. Still, something about the way the tracks weaved across the porch made me uneasy. They weren't heading in a straight line, they circled back on themselves, like whoever made them couldn't decide whether to stay or leave. I shook off the thought and unlocked the door. The hinges groaned in protest as I pushed it open, and a wave of frigid air greeted me. Inside, the cabin was dark and lifeless, just as I'd expected. Dust coated the furniture, and the smell of stale wood hung in the air. I set my bags down near the fireplace and lit the old kerosene lantern hanging by the door, casting a warm glow across the room. As I moved around the cabin, memories crept in like ghosts. The kitchen table where my dad used to carve wood, the couch where I'd fall asleep after long days of fishing. But tonight, those memories felt distant, drowned out by the cold reality of the present. Something wasn't right. I wasted no time getting a fire going. The wood crackled and popped as the flames took hold, and I crouched near the hearth, letting the warmth seep into my frozen fingers. But as I leaned closer to feed the fire, something caught my eye: ashes. They weren't old. In fact, they were still warm, glowing faintly beneath the fresh logs I'd just placed. Someone had used this fireplace recently. A knot tightened in my stomach as I straightened up, scanning the room. There was no sign of anyone else here, but the ash told a different story. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe my cousin had stopped by without telling me. He had a key, and it wouldn't be the first time he forgot to mention something like this. But when I spotted the mug sitting in the sink, still stained with dried coffee, my breath hitched. It wasn't mine. I walked over and touched the rim. Cold, but not dusty. My pulse thumped harder as I checked the back door. It was unlocked. The bedroom was next. The sheets on the bed had been pulled back, and the pillow was creased as if someone had been sleeping there. Someone who wasn't me. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the creaks of the cabin and the wind howling outside. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I wasn't alone. I should have left right then. Grabbed my bag, jumped back in the truck, and driven until I hit the nearest gas station. But instead, I did what anyone who's too stubborn for their own good would do. I ignored it. After all, what were the chances someone was still here? Whoever it was, they were probably long gone. At least, that's what I told myself as I cooked dinner, whistling a tune to drown out the growing sense of dread in my chest. The cabin wasn't empty. And someone, was waiting. The whiskey burned as I tipped the glass back, letting the warmth pool in my chest. I sat at the small wooden table in the cabin, the fire crackling steadily behind me, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, the snow was falling again, heavy and relentless, blanketing the trees in a thick curtain of white. For a moment, it felt like I could breathe again. The smell of seared steak still lingered in the air, mingling with the smoky warmth from the fire. The silence of the cabin was comforting, or at least it should have been. I wasn't relaxed. Not really. The footsteps on the porch earlier, the warm ashes, the mug in the sink, none of it made sense. I tried to shake the thoughts loose, rationalizing that the place had probably been used by a local hunter or a hiker who needed shelter. Maybe they hadn't cleaned up after themselves. That was possible, right? But the gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach refused to go away. I tapped my fingers against the table and turned my gaze to the window. The glass was fogged over, but I could still make out the shadowy outlines of the pines beyond the cabin. Their branches swayed gently under the weight of the fresh snowfall, creating eerie silhouettes that danced against the dim light from inside. It was beautiful, in a haunting kind of way. As I stared, my breath fogged up the window, and I caught my own reflection, a man trying hard not to admit he was scared. I hated the feeling. I wasn't the type to get worked up over nothing. But this was different. The way the snow muffled every sound outside only added to the eerie atmosphere. The wind howled faintly in the distance, but the cabin itself was deathly quiet. Too quiet. I stood up, needing to shake off the creeping tension before it could fully take hold. The floor creaked beneath my boots as I paced back toward the fireplace, feeding a fresh log into the flames. The fire snapped and popped, sending orange embers spiraling upward. I held my hands out to warm them, my gaze flicking back to the sink where that damn mug sat. Just forget about it, I told myself. Get through the night, enjoy the weekend, and head back to Sarah with nothing but a good story to tell. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. The first sound broke through my thoughts like a gunshot. It was faint, just a soft creak from the ceiling above me. My breath hitched, and I froze, listening intently. For a moment, there was nothing. Then it came again. Another creak. Slow. Deliberate. Like someone shifting their weight on the floorboards upstairs. I swallowed hard, my fingers instinctively curling into fists. My pulse pounded in my ears as I forced myself to stay calm. It's probably just the house settling, I thought, but even that excuse felt hollow. The sound was too deliberate. Too rhythmic. Whoever, or whatever, was up there wasn't trying to hide. Without taking my eyes off the ceiling, I reached for the small side table next to the fireplace and pulled open the drawer. My fingers found the cold, familiar grip of my .38 revolver. I always brought it with me on trips like this, just in case of wild animals or emergencies. Right now, it felt like the only thing keeping me from losing it entirely. The footsteps continued. They weren't wandering. They were moving with purpose, in time with the crackling of the fire, like a slow dance meant to keep me on edge. I stood there, frozen, until the sound stopped directly above me. For a few agonizing seconds, the cabin was completely silent. Then, I heard the first step on the staircase. The creak of the wood sent a jolt of adrenaline through my body. I spun around, leveling the gun toward the doorway that led to the stairs. My finger hovered over the trigger, and my voice came out low, steady, but strained. "I know you're there. Come down slowly, and I won't shoot." Silence. The fire crackled behind me, casting its glow across the doorway. I took a step forward, keeping the revolver raised. Another step on the stairs. Then another. Whoever it was wasn't running. They were descending slowly, deliberately, like they knew I was waiting. When the figure finally emerged at the bottom of the stairs, my breath hitched. A man stood there, thin and haggard, with a patchy beard covering his gaunt face. His clothes were worn and layered, an old flannel shirt beneath a tattered winter coat. His breath was ragged, visible in the cold air, and it smelled foul, like rotting food and sweat. But it was his eyes that froze me in place, wide, bloodshot, darting between me and the gun in my hand. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his voice raspy and weak. "I just needed a place to sleep." My grip on the gun tightened. "Then why the hell were you sneaking around?" "I didn't want to scare you," he answered, shifting slightly on his feet. "Well, you're doing a great job at that," I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. The firelight flickered across his face, highlighting the sunken hollows of his cheeks. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days, maybe weeks. We stood there in tense silence, the fire casting long shadows on the walls. The man swayed slightly, his eyes never leaving mine. Against every instinct screaming at me to kick him out, I hesitated. I backed up toward the kitchen, still keeping the gun trained on him, and grabbed the plate of half-eaten steak I'd left on the counter. I held it out. "Eat. Then get the hell out." He blinked, as if he hadn't expected the offer. His hands trembled as he took the plate, and without another word, he sat at the table, shoveling food into his mouth like a starving animal. I didn't lower the gun. Not for a second. When he was finished, I pointed toward the door. "The woodshed's empty," I said. "You can sleep there." He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and stood, nodding slowly. "Thank you." I followed him outside into the biting cold. The snow crunched beneath our boots as he trudged across the yard toward the shed. He ducked inside, and I slammed the door shut behind him, latching it securely. My breath came out in heavy clouds, and I stood there for a long moment, watching the woods. The wind howled through the trees, and I locked the cabin door behind me, bolting it tight. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls that seemed to shift and move. Exhaustion gnawed at me, but I knew I wouldn't sleep. Not tonight. I lay on the bed with the revolver resting on my chest, listening to the creaks of the cabin and the distant wail of the wind. My eyes fluttered shut, but my mind remained sharp, replaying every sound, every word the man had said. I didn't trust him. And as the hours dragged on, I waited, because something told me he wasn't finished with me yet. The storm worsened overnight. I knew it the moment I opened my eyes and saw the faint light of dawn struggling to push through the frost-covered windows. Wind rattled the cabin walls like a living thing trying to break in, and the fire had long since died, leaving the room bitterly cold. My breath fogged the air in heavy plumes, and my fingers were stiff as I fumbled to relight the hearth. I hadn't slept much. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind against the roof had me snapping awake, my hand clutching the revolver still resting on my chest. Each time I drifted off, I dreamed of the man. I saw his hollow eyes staring at me from the dark, heard his ragged breathing as he muttered something unintelligible. Now, as I crouched by the fire and watched the fresh kindling catch, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. Maybe through the shed window. Maybe through the woods, lurking just out of view. I shoved my boots on and zipped up my coat, exhaling sharply as I pulled on a hat and gloves. The weight of the revolver at my hip was the only comfort I had as I stepped out onto the porch. The snow was deep, up to my knees, and the icy wind tore at my face, making my eyes water. The woods surrounding the cabin were eerily quiet, muffled by the storm. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see the man's figure standing there among the pines, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of white. I trudged toward the shed, the snow crunching beneath my boots. The cold air bit into my lungs with every breath, and my heart thumped in my chest, beating louder than the wind. The shed door was still closed, just as I'd left it, with no footprints in the fresh snow leading away. I knocked once. No answer. "Hey," I called out, my voice muffled by the wind. "Time to go." Silence. A knot formed in my stomach. I knocked again, harder this time. "You hear me?" "You've overstayed your welcome." Nothing. My breath clouded the air in front of me as I fumbled with the latch and pulled the door open. The shed was empty. The old blankets I'd left in the corner were tossed aside, and the smell of damp wood and mildew filled my nose. But the man was gone. I stepped inside, scanning the small space as if he could somehow be hiding in plain sight. But the shed was too small for that. There was nowhere to hide, no trapdoor or secret exit. Just walls, a floor, and empty air. I backed out slowly, my boots crunching against the packed snow. The wind howled, and the trees groaned under the weight of the storm, but the quiet gnawed at me. There should have been footprints. There should have been some sign that he'd left. But the snow was untouched, a blank slate leading back to the cabin and into the woods. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty shed and the unmarked snow. My breath hitched as a sudden thought wormed its way into my mind. He never left. I spun around, scanning the tree line again, but it was just me and the trees. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of someone, whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound prickled the back of my neck. It was coming from the woods, distant but distinct, like a voice carried by the storm. I tightened my grip on the revolver and took a step back toward the cabin, my boots sinking into the snow with each step. The whispering didn't stop. It seemed to follow me, growing louder as I neared the porch. My breath quickened, and I slipped once, catching myself on the railing as I scrambled up the steps. I fumbled with the door, finally throwing it open and slamming it shut behind me. The bolt slid into place with a satisfying clunk, but it didn't make me feel any safer. I stood with my back against the door, heart pounding, listening. The whispering was gone. Just the wind now, battering the windows like it was desperate to come inside. I pulled off my coat and gloves, but I didn't bother with the boots. I needed to check the cabin to make sure I was truly alone. The revolver was a comforting weight in my hand as I moved through the small space, checking every corner, every shadow. The kitchen was empty. The bedroom, just as I'd left it. I even checked the small crawlspace under the bed, shining a flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there except dust and old cobwebs. I was alone. So why didn't it feel like it? I sat back down by the fire, feeding another log into the flames and watching them crackle to life. My nerves were shot, and I poured another glass of whiskey, taking a long, burning sip. The warmth spread through me, but it wasn't enough to calm the unease gnawing at my gut. The whispering was still there, buried in the back of my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me. I told myself that the man had probably left during the night, slipping away before the snow started falling again, and that's why there were no footprints. But no matter how many times I repeated it, I didn't believe it. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and closed my eyes, willing myself to relax. Just one weekend, I reminded myself. Just survive the weekend, and I could go back home, back to Sarah, back to normalcy. But as the firelight flickered and the wind howled outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still here. Watching. Waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in thought, but at some point, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, the fire had burned low, casting faint shadows on the walls. The room was cold again, and my breath fogged the air in front of me. But that wasn't what woke me. It was the sound of footsteps. Soft. Steady. Coming from upstairs. My fingers closed around the revolver, and my pulse raced as I stood up, listening intently. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, just like before. But this time, they weren't trying to hide. They were letting me know they were there. I swallowed hard, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. But I didn't. Instead, I took a step toward the staircase, gun raised, my finger hovering over the trigger. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps stopped. Silence. And then, from the darkness above, a voice answered, a low, raspy whisper that made my blood run cold. "You invited me in." The whisper slid down my spine like a knife made of ice. "You invited me in." My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively tightened my grip on the revolver. My heart hammered so loud, I swore it would echo through the walls of the cabin. The staircase stretched before me, its wooden planks disappearing into the dim shadows above. I hadn't turned on the upstairs light since I'd arrived. I never needed to. But now, that pitch-black void at the top of the stairs felt like a living thing, pulsing with malice. The cabin groaned as the wind howled against its walls. I took one step forward, my boot creaking against the wood. The air was colder near the staircase, and every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, back to the truck, back to civilization, anywhere but here. But I couldn't leave without knowing who, or what, was up there. "Come down," I called out, forcing my voice to stay steady. "I have a gun, and I'm not afraid to use it." No answer. I clenched my jaw and lifted the revolver higher, stepping onto the bottom stair. My breath puffed in front of me in misty plumes, and the cold air pressed against my skin, seeping through the fabric of my jacket. Another step. Then another. Each one groaned under my weight, the noise sounding deafening in the suffocating silence of the cabin. Halfway up the staircase, I stopped, listening. Nothing. The shadows above flickered faintly as the fire downstairs cast light across the walls, dancing like ghostly hands reaching out. My legs felt stiff, like I was wading through wet cement, but I forced myself to keep moving. When I reached the top of the stairs, the air was so cold that it stung my lungs. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, exactly how I'd left it. But now, something was wrong. The light coming through the door was faint, but I could see the bed clearly. The blankets were rumpled, the pillow dented, as though someone had just gotten up. The mug I'd seen earlier, the one with the dried coffee rings, was now resting on the nightstand, perfectly upright, as though someone had placed it there intentionally. My pulse thundered in my ears as I swept the room with the revolver, half expecting to see the man hiding in a corner, waiting to pounce. But the room was empty. Just the bed, the dresser, and the creaking walls that seemed to mock me with their eerie groans. A faint noise behind me made my head snap around. It wasn't the wind, it was something closer, something soft, like fabric brushing against wood. My gaze shifted to the attic hatch near the ceiling, the old wooden square that led to the storage space above the cabin. It was slightly open, the edges of the panel hanging down just an inch, casting a shadow on the wall. The whisper came again, clearer this time, drifting down from the attic like a breath of wind. "You shouldn't have come back." I staggered backward, my shoulder bumping into the doorframe. My knuckles whitened as I tightened my grip on the gun, my mind racing. I didn't remember leaving the attic open. Hell, I hadn't even thought about the attic since I'd arrived. But someone, or something, had been up there. I wasn't going to check. I wasn't that stupid. I backed out of the room, careful not to turn my back to the attic hatch. The shadows seemed to move on their own, slithering across the walls like they were alive. I reached the staircase and took the steps 2 at a time, the wood creaking under my boots as I descended. The cabin felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in on me, suffocating me. When I reached the bottom, I bolted the front door again, triple-checking the lock before leaning against it, trying to catch my breath. My mind was spiraling, every logical explanation slipping through my fingers like water. I had to leave. Screw the supplies, screw the storm, I needed to get to the truck and get the hell out of here. I grabbed my coat from the hook by the door and slung it over my shoulders, my fingers trembling as I zipped it up. My boots crunched against the floor as I crossed the room and reached for my bag, but something stopped me cold. The fire was out. It had been burning when I went upstairs. I'd made sure of it. But now, the hearth was filled with nothing but cold, blackened wood, and the faint smell of smoke hung in the air. My breath fogged in front of me, and I realized just how cold the room had become. Something moved in my peripheral vision. I spun around, gun raised, and aimed it at the kitchen doorway. The shadows flickered again, just beyond the threshold, as though someone had darted out of sight. My chest heaved, and I fought to steady my breathing. "Show yourself!" I shouted, my voice cracking. Silence. Then, a noise so faint it could have been imagined, the creak of the attic hatch closing, sealing itself back into place. I swallowed hard, the bile rising in my throat. My fingers trembled on the gun's grip, and I forced myself to take a deep breath. The shadows weren't moving anymore, but the sense of being watched was suffocating. My mind was a mess, caught between disbelief and primal fear, but one thought pushed through the chaos: you're not safe here. I grabbed my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and made a beeline for the door. My boots stomped across the floor, each step echoing like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. I yanked the door open, the icy wind hitting me like a punch to the face, and stepped outside. The snow was deeper than it had been that morning, and the wind whipped through the trees with a banshee's wail. My truck was parked at the edge of the clearing, half buried under a fresh layer of snow. I waded through the drifts, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I fought against the wind. Behind me, the cabin loomed like a forgotten relic, its windows dark and its roof covered in snow. But something was off. The front door, the one I had just locked behind me, was now wide open, swinging gently in the wind. Panic surged through me, and I threw my bag into the truck's bed before scrambling into the driver's seat. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. In the rearview mirror, I saw movement. A figure stood on the porch, barely visible in the swirling snow. It was the man from the night before, or at least, it looked like him. His tattered coat flapped in the wind, and his face was obscured by shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me, boring into the back of my skull. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I slammed the truck into gear, the tires spinning in the snow before finally catching traction. The cabin disappeared behind me as I sped down the narrow path, my breath hitching with every bump and turn. I didn't look back again. I couldn't. The whisper still echoed in my mind, clear as day: "You invited me in." The truck's tires roared against the icy dirt road, each slip of traction making my heart jump into my throat. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, my eyes locked on the path ahead. Trees blurred by in streaks of gray and white, but even through the howling wind outside, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. The man on the porch, was it really him? His shadowed figure lingered in the corners of my mind. I blinked hard, trying to focus on the road, but every time I did, I saw him again, standing there, his tattered coat flapping like a warning flag in the storm. The road curved sharply to the right, and I nearly oversteered into a ditch. "Come on," I muttered, pleading with the truck to keep going. The wind shrieked against the windows, and the cabin felt too small, too suffocating, as if I could still hear that voice whispering, "You shouldn't have come back." I wanted to scream, to drown out the whispers and the echoes in my head, but all I could do was drive. The storm was relentless. Snow piled up faster than the windshield wipers could clear it, reducing my visibility to almost nothing. Headlights cut through the white haze, but it was like driving through a dream or a nightmare. The trees on either side of me stood like silent sentinels, their skeletal branches swaying ominously. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing in the middle of the road, but there was only swirling snow. Or so I thought. Just as I was about to look away, something flickered in the mirror. My breath hitched. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding across the icy road until the truck came to a jerking halt. The seatbelt dug into my chest as I jolted forward, and for a moment, everything was silent except for the steady hum of the engine and my own ragged breathing. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Slowly, I shifted my gaze back to the rearview mirror. At first, there was nothing, just the pale glow of my taillights reflecting off the snow-covered road. But then, just beyond the red glow, something moved. It wasn't the man from the porch. It was something else. A figure emerged from the tree line, tall and thin, with arms that seemed too long for its body. Its head tilted slightly, as if curious, and its face, or what I could see of it, was obscured by shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but the way it moved, slow and deliberate, made my skin crawl. Panic surged through me, and I floored the gas pedal. The tires spun wildly before catching traction, and the truck lurched forward. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. The road was a winding labyrinth, but I'd driven it enough times to know the turns by instinct. I pushed the truck faster than I should have, the back tires fishtailing on the icy patches. Branches scraped against the windows like fingernails on glass, and the wind howled like a chorus of ghosts, but I didn't care. I had to get out of those woods. The road eventually straightened, and I saw the outline of the highway up ahead, a dark, blessed stretch of asphalt that led back to town. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Just as I merged onto the highway, the truck's headlights caught something in the distance. It was standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes again, the tires screeching as the truck skidded to a stop. My breath came in short gasps, fogging up the windshield. The figure was there, about 50 feet ahead, illuminated by the harsh glow of my headlights. But this time, it wasn't a shadowy blur or a trick of the light. It was the man from the cabin. He stood perfectly still, his head slightly bowed, his arms hanging limply at his sides. His tattered coat flapped in the wind, and snow clung to his matted hair. His face was pale, almost gray, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. And his eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, were locked on me. I didn't wait for him to move. My foot hit the gas, and the truck surged forward, but the man didn't flinch. He didn't even try to get out of the way. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I braced for impact, but just as the truck was about to hit him, he disappeared. The tires screeched as I swerved to avoid the empty space where he had just been. The truck skidded off the road, crashing through a snowbank before coming to a stop in a shallow ditch. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, my fingers numb against the steering wheel. He was gone. I threw the door open and stumbled out into the snow, my boots sinking into the powder. The cold wind bit at my skin, but I barely noticed. I scanned the road, the trees, the ditch, everywhere, but there was no sign of him. No footprints. No shadow. Nothing. I staggered back to the truck, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared back to life. I didn't waste any time. I backed out of the ditch and sped down the highway, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. By the time I reached the town's outskirts, the storm had started to let up. Streetlights cast a dim glow over the snow-covered roads, and the sight of familiar buildings should have been comforting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner and parked near the entrance, the truck's engine ticking as it cooled. My breath fogged up the windows, and I wiped them clean with my sleeve before leaning back against the seat. What the hell had just happened? I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of it all. The man. The footprints. The whispers. I thought of the cabin, standing alone in the woods, and how it had felt like the walls themselves were watching me. I thought of the attic hatch and the way it had closed on its own. And then, I thought of that whisper, "You invited me in." I knew I should call someone. The police, maybe, or a friend. But what could I say? That a ghost or a shadow had followed me home? That I'd seen someone disappear into thin air? Instead, I pulled out my phone and stared at the screen, the glow casting eerie shadows across the dashboard. My fingers hovered over the contacts list, but I didn't call anyone. I couldn't. Not yet. Because deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't over. And whatever was out there, it wasn't done with me.